Hey Slavic Vikings, and welcome to a video where I'll talk about the world's oldest flags. Both ones that were lost to history tens of thousands of years ago, and ones that are still used to this day. But first, why do we even have flags? And in short, it's because of tribalism. Early tribes, hundreds and tens of thousands of years ago, needed a way to differentiate each other from each other. And art through different markings and flags are a way to do this. So these proto-flags or symbolic banners existed tens of thousands of years ago, long before written history. And these early humans used animal skins and painted cloths or wooden symbols to mark their different tribes and rituals. But sadly, fabric and organic materials decay very quickly, so none of these survived archaeologically, and therefore today I'm gonna talk about the ones that did survive and are still used today. However, like I mentioned in many of my videos, the concept of the nation-state, nationality in itself, is a very new thing, so these first flags or banners were used as more military symbols to represent the country or aristocracy rather than a specific ethnicity or nation. And with that we go to our first flag, the oldest flag in history that is still used to this day, and that being the Dannebrog, or the Danish flag, a beautiful red background with a white cross. And according to legend, in 1219, near Tallinn, Estonia, during Denmark's crusades to Christianize the Baltic, the Danish king of Valdemar was ambushed by Estonian tribes, and he sadly began to lose. But however, through the darkness, the red flag with the right cross supposedly fell from the sky, inspiring the Danes to win the battle, and the army rallied under this new flag, and that's why it became known as Dannebrog. However, the flag was only first recorded during the 14th century, and it was only official since the 1600s. But even by this measurement, it's still the oldest flag that's in continuous use. If you want to know more about the Nordic cross and these Scandinavian type flags, check out this video I made 3 years ago. The second oldest flag is the Hinomaru, or the Japanese flag, of a white background and red dot. And this symbol appeared on samurai banners in the 12th centuries, representing the sun goddess of Amaterasu, and therefore it solidified Japan's identity as the land of the rising sun. From the 1600s, flags with red rays, like the red dot just with red rays, symbolized the rising sun's power, and therefore it was officially adopted by the imperial army in 1870, becoming the key emblem of imperial and fascist Japan. So when we see this Japanese flag with red rays, it's often seen as the fascist flag of Japan. However, it's also worth mentioning that the sun symbol in itself dates back to at least the 7th century, when Japan first called itself Nihon, or the origin of the sun. And this is why some people say that Japan has the oldest flags, because of these sun symbols. The third oldest flag in history that's still in use is Austria, their red, white and red flag. I would like to mention that this flag is very similar to the flag of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth or Poland through hundreds of years. Poland used to use this flag when it was a kingdom. The reason why Austria has this flag, according to legend, Duke Leopold soaked his white beautiful tunic in blood. He only had a white stripe left on his tunic, and that's why Austria has this flag. It was used from the 1230s, however officially only it got incorporated much later. And throughout history, it wasn't used that much in Austria, since Austria united with Hungary and Germany took over them and all that. But after World War II, it got incorporated back to democratic Austria. Next up, we have Scotland, which has the St. Andrew's Cross, and this was officially used by the late 1300s, and obviously later it got merged into the Union Jack of the United Kingdom, but the origin of this flag is all the way back from the 1st century, where St. Andrew was crucified on an X-shaped cross, and that's why it's his sacred symbol. So not like Jesus on this normal cross, but just a cross that was like an X shape. And according to myth, In the 9th century, a vision of that cross in the sky inspired a Scottish victory in battle, leading to its adaptation in the national flag. Very similar story to the Danish Dannebrog. Next up we have Switzerland, which, much like Denmark, has a white cross on red, and it is originated in the 14th century when it was used as military banners, and it has this very iconic square shape, not rectangular like most other flags. And in short, it was just a symbol of unity and neutrality. However, this is misleading since Switzerland wasn't that neutral throughout most of history. It only really started being neutral when Napoleon humiliated them. So these were the oldest flags in history that are still used to this day. However, there are flags that we know of that are much older than that. For example, the Roman Vexillum, used for many hundreds of years in the most powerful country in history, the Roman Empire. It is the oldest surviving cloth flag that we know of, and it was used by the Roman legions as a military standard, a square cloth hanging from a horizontal bar on a spear. It often bore the letters of SPQR or other images of gods, and this SPQR stood for the Senate and People of Rome, which basically meant to symbolize that the government was working for the people. This surviving flag is kept in the Pushkin Museum, and it's pretty cool that this is the oldest flag that we actually have. Another flag worth mentioning is the Persian Derafsh Kaviani flag. According to legends, this flag originated 2,000 to 3,000 years before Jesus was born. However, sadly, it was destroyed during the Arab conquests in the year 700 after Jesus. Very sad this flag was destroyed. However, it's debated on how old this flag actually was. Some people say 1,000 years before Jesus, some 3,000. However, it's undisputed that this flag was very old. Therefore, it's super sad that this flag got destroyed. So Iran can be proud of this one. However, it's also worth mentioning China and Egypt, because these are the places where the oldest civilizations on Earth were founded and existed for thousands of years. And therefore, logically, there were flags and banners used in these civilizations for thousands of years before any of the ones I mentioned earlier. And these, therefore, were used for thousands of years, but sadly, none of these survive. And like I mentioned earlier, flags don't really survive well in history because they're made on cloth or paper or fabric, and these don't really survive the test of time, the test of history, like for example in carvings on rocks do. So that's why flags are surprisingly one of the few things in history that are not documented very well. And for example, the flag of the Kalmar Union has no documented history. It is only documented through text and descriptions. And that is actually how we get most of our information on the history of flags, or the vexillology I should say, is by the descriptions of writers throughout history of these flags, where writers and monks literally described how flags looked like in their books instead of drawing them, which is kind of interesting. But like I said, in China, dynasties like the Zhou from 1000 to 200 before Christ, or the Han from 200 before Christ to 200 after Christ, they used dragon and sun emblems on silk flags for military and imperial display. However, none of these survive physically, but they're depicted in tombs and carvings and chronicles, showing that the idea of flags in itself predates the nations by millennia. And going back to our flags that are still in use and that we have real evidence of, did you notice that all of the oldest flags, like Japan, Austria, Switzerland, and Denmark, they were all red and white? And I've noticed this, and it's kind of interesting how they're so consistently red and white. The only non-red and white country that we covered was Scotland, and this has many reasons, one of them being that it was simply the easiest and cheapest colors to produce historically. Nowadays, we take for granted the chemical reactions that cause all of the colors of the rainbow that can easily be bought in any store. However, back in the day, coloring was a true show of wealth, especially purple. That's why there were no flags that had the purple color. The first flag was quite recently during the Civil War in Spain. But that's why throughout history, most flags only had red or white, simply because these were the easiest colors to produce, since red was from madder root, carmine or cochineal insects, while white was literally just undyed cloth or bleached linen. Even colors like blue and green were expensive or faded quickly. Another reason countries used red and white was because red, being the color of blood, represented the color of sacrifice, while white represented purity, especially in Christianity. Another reason might be just because red and white stand out clearly, especially from a distance. But in summary, flags are one of the oldest things in civilization, yet one of the least documented in history. That's why it's very fascinating to look at the oldest ones that we actually have, and the oldest flags that are still used to this day. If you like videos on history, check out my history playlist. Maybe consider subscribing. You can always subscribe in the future if you change your mind. And as always, farewell, żegnam, and goodbye.